It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, David C. Barnett. David is a reporter and producer at WVIZ, PBS, and 90.3 WCPN, ideastream, and he is the 2012 national winner of the prestigious Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence in Electronic Journalism. Please join me in welcoming my friend, David C. Barnett.
Man, you want me to follow those guys? I've done a couple, I'll try to be brief because I know your guys' rear ends are really getting cold right about now. I've done a couple of radio stories on the subject of suicide over the past couple of years, so I'd like to tell you a little bit about how those came around. This is my second time to this event. My first visit was 1 year ago, right after I'd gotten back from scattering the ashes of my brother Frank in the Rocky Mountains with some close friends and relatives. I'd never hung out with people who had lost loved ones to suicide, and I was a little bit uncomfortable. When I came here to the walk, I wasn't quite sure what I would find. Would it be a really sad and somber event? And what I found was something totally different. I found a great community of people who had all shared the horrible experience of suicide, but were able to smile, laugh, cry, and thrive in each other's company. And I was reminded of, I've done stories with war veterans, and when I talk to them, they'd say they don't want to talk about their experience to outsiders because outsiders wouldn't understand what they've been through. And I felt the same way. Haven't you felt that way sometimes? You just can't talk about it except if it's to someone else who has come to understand it. And it gave me an idea of doing a radio story, which I called Left Behind. And it was about the suicide survivors, the survivors of suicide who go on living. I'm talking about the husbands and the wives and the children of people who take their lives. And thanks to the help of some people I hooked up with here, including Lori Vick, Pat Lydon, Denise O'Brien, her son Kevin, Dr. Robert Ronis, I got a chance to tell our story. I make my living telling stories. And as a reporter, I was a little bit uneasy putting myself into this one because we're not supposed to do that. A person like me is supposed to be neutral. It's not supposed to be part of the story. I'm just supposed to present the facts and let the listener sort them out. But I disobeyed the rule this time because I felt like I could probably tell this story and help others understand at least part of it. It helped the others who had lost people, the people who were left behind, and help them get through that. I could tell a story that would let others know that they weren't alone in some of the conflicting feelings that come after you lose a loved one to suicide. There's a number of those feelings, and I'll bet some of you here have had one or maybe all of these feelings. Sometimes it's guilt. What could I have done to stop him from doing what he did? Sometimes it's anger. How could she do that to me? And sometimes, and this may be the hardest one to come to terms with, it's a feeling of relief. After all this time of putting up with really annoying behavior, I can finally relax. In doing a story, I could also explain to those outsiders the feelings of stigma that many of us who are left behind feel. Like when you meet somebody new and they ask, well, tell me about yourself. Any brothers or sisters? One brother. Oh, really? What's he do? He passed away. Oh, I'm so sorry. How did he die? Now, there's a conversation stopper for you right there. Since most of us here tonight are veterans, I'd like to tell you the story of my brother Frank, because I know you'll understand. Though I don't know that anybody will ever understand why Frank took his life, but I'll bet you'll recognize at least part of my story as your own. My brother, who was my only sibling, had an inauspicious start to this world. At the tender age of 3 days old, the doctors discovered a tumor that was attached to his adrenal gland. And they operated on this 3-day-old baby and took out what turned out to be a benign growth. but it left a scar across his stomach for the rest of his life. But otherwise, he was a pretty healthy kid. And we had a great relationship. Some of my friends would say we had an abnormal relationship because we never fought. I'd hear stories all the time growing up saying, you guys never fought? That's just weird. And I'd hear stories about mean brothers and sisters who were annoying or picked on them or teased them. But that never happened with Frank. I couldn't relate to that. We had similar senses of humor. We shared a lot of private jokes at our parents' expense. And he was even part of my early radio career in a way, because as kids we used my dad's tape recorder. I kind of snuck and used it behind his back, and we created adventure dramas and comic versions of game shows. I've got a tape at home of us doing Jeopardy, which is pretty funny. But my journey into the land of the left behind began with a phone call a couple years ago from one of Frank's close friends who told me that he had sent a cryptic email that sounded to her like a suicide note. I'm getting this call in the middle of the day and I'm hearing a suicide note? That seems extreme, but I hadn't seen him in a couple days, and she said she couldn't get hold of him, so I went to our neighborhood police station to file a missing persons report, and while waiting in the reception area, I got a phone call. And the person identified themselves as a security officer in a building downtown. "Are you David Barnett?" "Yes." "Is Frank Barnett your brother?" "Yes." "Have you seen him lately?" "No, and as a matter of fact, I'm here at the police station filling out a missing persons report. I haven't seen him for a couple days." "Oh, no, you don't have to worry. We found him. He's had a medical emergency. Could you come downtown? We'll have someone meet you when you get here." So what am I to think? I'm driving downtown, and I reflected on Frank's more recent history. He had struggled to find a new job after being laid off 3 years ago. There were debts he couldn't repay. He was living on canned soup and peanut butter sandwiches. But through it all, he seemed to maintain a Job-like acceptance of his misfortune. And now this guy's telling me he's had a medical emergency, whatever that was, but at least he was still alive. I met a policeman as I parked next to a downtown office building, and as he escorted me to the front door, he paused to ask, "So, are you from the coroner's office?" Suddenly, I felt like I was in a dream. We walked into the building, and everything seemed like it was in slow motion as I moved past the people who were all staring at me. I ducked under the police tape and met the man who told me that Frank had hanged himself in a nearby storage closet. That was my introduction to suicide. Up until then, I'd never known anyone who'd lost a loved one in that way. I went through the next few weeks in a haze after drifting through the details of a memorial service, the cremation, the endless legal paperwork. I started searching out others like you folks who had gone through the same thing. And that research led to my Left Behind story, which we had on the air. You know, Frank was never diagnosed with a mental illness like Dr. Calabrese was talking about. But in retrospect, there were growing indications that something wasn't right. I just didn't get the bigger picture. He had a quick temper. He became increasingly irritable as his fruitless search for a job dragged on, and occasionally there were angry outbursts at the slightest provocation. He took up the practice of yoga and meditation, and that seemed to calm the fury inside of his head for a little while, but it just ended up being a Band-Aid for a much deeper problem. Frank's behavior was annoying, and sometimes, I got to tell you, it was a little bit frightening. But I chalked it up to, he had an edgy personality, I guess, and we never really talked about it. I avoided the subject of talking about it. Law enforcement authorities have determined that Frank took his life at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of September 14th, 2010. Many years before, like many of us, he had checked off that box on the bottom of your driver's license application to be an organ donor. And the local organization that does that and handles those sorts of things is called Life Bank. And they called me as soon as the police alerted them to Frank's death. And the Life Bank phone counselor asked if it would be okay with them, for them, to go ahead and recover pieces and parts of Frank's body so that others could live or maybe help them live. And I quickly answered, yes, please, let something good come out of this experience, this horrible experience. The organ donation process was the subject of another story that I did. That's the one that won the Edward R. Murrow Award. It's called Frank's Donation, and in it, I interviewed all the people at Life Bank connected with my brother's case. They even supplied me with recordings of my conversations with the phone counselor on that terrible night. But there's one tape that I didn't use in my story that I'd like to share with you now. It was a call that came very late in the evening on the day of his death. The counselor said, "David, the surgeons are getting ready to recover on Frank." That means they're ready to operate on him. And they have a question. They said they discovered a scar on his stomach, and they were wondering if you knew what that was. And I held my breath, and I told them the story about a 3-day-old baby who had had an operation 55 years ago, and how the doctors took out a benign tumor. Up until that moment, the events of September 14th, 2010 had been a blur. Several people told me that Frank was dead, but it never became real until that moment when I pictured my brother's lonely body lying on that operating table. After the useful parts of that body were removed and the organ and tissue recovery process took place, Frank was cremated, and we took his ashes, as I said, to the Rocky Mountains. It was a dark and drizzly evening when family and friends gathered in the clearing above Golden, Colorado. Each of us grabbed a handful of Frank and sent him flying into the fog. And he scattered into the sky, bits of him maybe helping the earth grow a little bit, settling down onto the land. Frank was gone, and yet, you know what? He really wasn't. I felt the sandy remains of his former self that clung to my wet hands as we walked back to the car. In a sense, Frank will always be with me. There'll always be bits of him like grains under my fingernails that can never be scrubbed away. Because of what happened to him, I would hope that I'm a little more sensitive to someone in trouble, more proactive. I know now that whenever I see someone who seems down, I ask them, "Are you okay?" Simple as that. Most of us here aren't psychologists or psychiatrists, but it seems to me that reaching out and starting a conversation can be useful and maybe critical to someone who feels alone and isolated. Be willing to listen. Tell them that you're concerned and tell them why. Give them examples. After my experience, I know that sometimes it's important to ask that person the suicide question. Are you thinking about taking your life? Do you have a plan to do so? And if they say yes, get them to some help. There's something else I'd like to leave behind for you, to you. Don't be afraid to tell your story. I know you don't have a radio microphone necessarily, but you have a voice, and in using your voice, you can illuminate to those others about a very dark corner of our culture. I don't have to tell you that suicide is one of those last taboo topics. People just don't want to talk about it because it's scary. But it's important that we do talk about it. You have the power to let someone know that they are not alone. You can help others understand that suicide and depression are preventable. You can help erase the stigma. You can help further support SPEA and its prevention work. And you can help us all walk into the light. Thanks for listening.